Hello and welcome to session 3 on Doubting Climate Change, the role of public relations in creating doubt about the science behind climate change. In this session we're going to be continuing our look at the work of Edward Bernays, the self-proclaimed father of public relations. Last week we finished up looking at Torches of Freedom. This session we're going to be looking at the work he did in the coup d'etat in Guatemala in the 1950s. So Bernays kept working for 20 or so years with corporations and developed this notion of public relations as distinct from advertising. So at the same time, through the 1940s, 1950s, after the Second World War, there was the rise of modern advertising on the whole Madison Avenue. And if any of you have watched the Mad Men series, the TV show, it's quite an interesting exploration of what happened in Wall Street and in Madison Avenue during the development of the advertising industry. And in parallel to that was running what Bernays was doing in the public relations industry as a way of interacting with people. So one of Bernays' customers in 1950s was the United Fruit Company. It's an American-based corporation who were growing bananas and importing bananas into the US for retail sale, and they were being grown in Guatemala. And so the United Fruit Company owned land in Guatemala. There were free democratic elections in Guatemala, and the Socialist Party won the election. And so they saw the use of their land to create fruit for another country as not a productive use of land and not benefiting them, because they weren't making any revenue from that. They weren't having access to the fruit or to the land. And so they nationalized the farms where the bananas were being grown. And this concerned the United States, one, because it was cutting off a valuable supply of bananas to a corporation that was a valuable player in the corporate market in the United States, but also it was a socialist government. And the United States, coming out of the Second World War, was paranoid about socialism and communism. And so the CIA were a little bit concerned about this and the impact that could have on other countries on which the US relied for extractive products. And so the CIA worked with Bernays to create a public relations campaign that was part of a CIA plot to overthrow the democratically elected government. And it was successful. The government got overthrown. There was a right-wing government came into power because of the coup d'etat, and so business was run as normal for the United Fruit Company. So this was the first visible time that public relations got involved in this level of state play, if you will, and statesmanship or craftsmanship. And it's kind of interesting because it goes back to this notion that Bernays had, where his uncle had said that to maintain order in society, people needed to be controlled. And so he started to understand or explore even greater how that control could happen and how public relations could become a controlling mechanism in society. So 1947, he wrote a book called The Engineering of Consent, and his ideas were made concrete a little bit more in that. So he talked about the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses as being an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. So he was saying the United States wasn't run by the democratically elected company, it was run by these shadowy forces behind government. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, and our ideas suggested largely by men. Notice it's men because of the generation he was living in, that we've never heard of. It's they who pull the wires that control the public mind. So this goes to the heart of his vision of what public relations was. It was about controlling society. It wasn't just about getting people to buy a particular type of breakfast cereal or a particular brand of car, all of which he did, but it was about exercising power to maintain status quo in society. So to try to quell any revolutionary changes or any political diversions that people in authority might not like, and this continuation of corporate power. And the relevance of this to where we are today is quite profound. But I'll just play you a little clip so you can hear in Bernays' own words about how he sees the engineering of consent and how he justifies it to some extent by intermixing this notion of consent and choice and freedom.
Public relations embraces what I call the engineering of consent, based on Thomas Jefferson's principle that in a democratic society, everything depends on the consent of the people.
So you'll notice in that clip, he's considerably older than he was in the 1950s. And I think it was at this point because people had started to realize that what he had done and what he was doing was unethical and immoral. And it went beyond the corporate notion of public relations, if you will. So there was a societal pushback against him and against his work, and he spent the last years of his life trying to defend his reputation and say and to moralize about saying what he was doing was actually for the good of society. So how do we take that into today's world? I'll go to Morris and Goldworthy, who are two academics who study public relations. And in 2012, they came with the definition that public relations is the planned persuasion of people to behave in ways which further the sponsor's objectives, whoever the sponsor is. And it's the notion of it's the planned persuasion by somebody other than the people themselves. So again, it's recognizing that public relations isn't necessarily part of a democratic process. And it works primarily using media relations and other forms of third-party endorsement. So there are a lot of definitions around public relations, but most of them kind of gloss over the manipulative nature of it and how public relations is largely used by influential and rich organizations to control the masses. Whether it's through the availability of consumer goods, so long as I've got 2 TVs and 2 cars, I'm happy, I'm not going to challenge anything. And again, we see this kind of notion in the United States in the recent election where a lot of people are very unhappy with their standard of living, with the cost of food, with the cost of gas. Even though the country as a whole is doing well, it hasn't trickled down to the masses, and so they're fearful about what the future holds for them. So again, one can argue that they've been manipulated into believing a vision of the society in which they're living to generate a particular political result. And this is part of the democratic process. And when you look at the vast amounts of money that are spent in elections, not just in the United States, but in countries around the world, you realize that notion of controlling people and making people think that they have choice and allowing them to make decisions and choices for themselves is actually almost a false narrative, because the media, in whatever form the media has, does control our outcomes to a large extent. So moving into the 21st century, we've seen in the election and we've seen over social media the rise of an information spectrum. So if you go back 50 years, 60 years, the information spectrum was people of authority spoke to the rest of us. They're the ones that created the information. In the scientific world, I'm a scientist, I get evidence, I get data, I analyze that, I publish the results. It's a peer-reviewed process. And these are evidence-based facts, so it's very difficult for anybody to challenge them. Today's information sphere is that information, but then that's been added to by 3 distinct other types of information around falseness and sometimes with an intention to harm. So again, the definitions around these are somewhat loose, but we have the notion of misinformation, the notion of disinformation, and the notion of malinformation. So we have evidence-based, and then we have misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And it's in these gray areas around misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation that we see corporations nowadays creating doubt by using public relations, by using the media, by using everything that we've talked about with Bernays, in terms of trying to undermine public trust in established science, in established institutions, shall we say. So this started with climate change. It's really interesting. It started with a peer-reviewed article. And usually when you're talking about peer-reviewed articles as a scientist or a social scientist, as a scientist you talk about an article of 5 to 7 pages long. Social science, it can be like up to 20 pages long. It's peer-reviewed, gone through process, you've got data, you've got analysis, everything like this. Naomi Oreskes, who's a Harvard she's a social scientist, history of science is her particular field. She did a meta-analysis of 928 peer-reviewed scientific papers that were written by climatologists and other climate experts. Her paper wasn't even a paper, it was an essay. It was 1 page long. You see the entirety of it in front of you. And the paper came to the conclusion that, and I've put it in red, you can't read that, so I've made it larger here, without substantial disagreement, the 928, or the authors of the 928 papers found human activities are heating the Earth's surface without debate, okay? And the actual figure that she came out of those 928 peer-reviewed papers was 97% of them agreed with the notion, or substantive, there was no substantial disagreement that the cause of global warming, global heating, climate change was human originated. She published this paper, or this essay, in 2004, and she was immediately subjected to career assassination. So there were corporate interests who were trying to undermine everything she'd ever done in her academic career because they saw her as a real threat to what they were doing in terms of continuing to extract fossil fuels and encourage us to continue to burn them and build our society on the consumption of fossil fuel. So they tried to destroy her career. They harassed her at her home. And this is something that was ongoing. It wasn't just once or twice. This went on for years. And anybody who'd worked with her or had published with her was subject to the similar kind of attacks on her credibility and her integrity. And what the fossil fuel companies did in response to this is that they started to create articles of their own, or pay scientists to create other articles that were countering this one. But the mistake that they made was that the scientists that they were using to create these counter-narratives weren't climatologists, they weren't climate scientists, they weren't people who had invested their entire career in the development of evidence around what's happening in the climate. And why does that matter? So we'll look at anthropogenic global warming, anthropogenic climate change. So the language has changed a little bit. It used to be about global warming when Al Gore talked about inconvenient truths and things like this. And now we talk about climate change because even the term that was applied, global warming, didn't apply to everybody on the planet because through climate change, some people are going to get colder. So if the North Atlantic current turns off, as it's in the process potentially of doing at the moment, it means that Northern Europe will largely become uninhabitable because of the cold and the formation of ice sheets. So global warming was a scientific term that was used to address an issue, but not from a global perspective, which was kind of interesting. And because of that choice of a word, it allowed people to undermine the science because they say, well, you're saying it's global warming, but there are places that are getting colder. And there was evidence to support that. So even that choice of a word allowed people to start to undermine the argument. And why does consensus matter? And here's a little graphic here that says that 66% of US media coverage supports climate or the argument about global warming, et cetera, et cetera. So you have the way that the science is on the right-hand side, the way that the public perceive it, and the way that the media perceive it. And you'll notice that there's 97% of climate scientists believe that climate change is anthropogenic and we can do something to stop it. 66% of the media and 45% of the public believe that. So somewhere from the scientific language coming out of through the publication process of science and the scientists being interviewed on media programs, somewhere over 50% of an audience is being lost. And it's into that space that the oil companies are using public relations and using the media to inject this notion of doubt, to try to undermine the credibility of science because of the language that they use, because of the methodologies that they use. And the mission here was, I just put it there, the mission of the report is to make people aware of the impact that humans have on climate. And I pulled up here a graphic just to show that we're now in this Anthropocene some people will say we're in Anthropocene, which means we're in a geological era that is defined by men, or by humankind, sorry, not men. It's defined by humankind. So big oil, and there's a really attractive photograph, if you will, of an oil refinery in the southern United States. But big oil's response to all of this is some research here done by the Harvard Gazette. So the researchers here are charting the evolution from denial of the impact of humans and the fossil fuel industry on climate change to misdirection. So as an entity that's actually in place to track what's happening currently in that world. And the result of their analysis is the takeaway message across all of our work is that over and over, ExxonMobil, which is the largest company, but other companies alongside that, have misled the public about climate change by telling the public one thing and by saying and doing the opposite behind closed doors. And part of the work that Noemi Oreskes did and other researchers have done is to gain access to the documentation that the companies actually have in their archives about what was said at meetings, about memos that were sent. And somebody uncovered this as a corporate memo, Exxon's position on global warming, climate change, emphasized the uncertainty in scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect. So this is quite an old one. This is maybe 20 years old when it was still global warming. It talked about the greenhouse effect, how fossil fuels, carbon monoxide goes up or carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere, and it starts to reflect the sun's rays. So we become warmer as a globe. So they talk about uncertainty. So their position was to emphasize the uncertainty. And the question mark here is, when you have 97% of scientists who are working in that field saying there is no uncertainty, it shows that they were trying to exploit that 3%. Okay? And then we have to look about how that 3% is represented in the media. And they talk about urging a balanced scientific approach. And there's two words that are really interesting. One is the uncertainty, when it's obvious there is very little uncertainty. And the second thing is this notion of a balanced scientific approach. So here's a graphic. This is how traditional media have, for the last 30 years, presented the discourse around climate change. So you have, and I'm not sure if you can see the figures very clearly, but on one side you have 97%, and the text underneath says the evidence-based science. And on the other side of the balance is 3%, where it says there's no evidence, so it's just opinion. No evidence to support it at all. But this is how the media have presented it, as an evenly balanced debate, as an evenly balanced discussion. And in reality, what they should have been doing is presenting it like this, where you have 97% of the weight of the argument is down touching evidence-based science, and the 3% is up in the air with no evidence opinion at all. And this is how they should have been presenting. And this is what, when we looked at what the BBC have changed in their guidelines for how to present things in 2020, they recognized that previously they've been presenting things as a balanced argument, when in reality they should have been presenting it as the graphic here shows, 97% on one side, 3% on the other side, because then that excludes pretty much most of the doubt that's created. Thank you so much for watching this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.